disability is seen as sometimes a bad word and something that needs to be covered up. I think that people treat me differently, whether I'm using a different style cane or a mobility aid. I knew I needed a seat, but I didn't feel like I had a right to one without a mobility aid. Her stance was that I couldn't be as disabled or as needing as her, just purely based on age. I first felt very, uncomfortable and out of place using a cane. I don't think people recognize how difficult it can be to not have a diagnosis. My name is Carly. I am 25 years old. I have been disabled since I was 16 or 17, and primarily I manage severe chronic pain in my hip, but I also have a plethora of other conditions that have shown up over the years. I have no proper diagnosis for my primary condition, which has been difficult to manage over time, and have come to terms a lot more with it. So when I became disabled, I was still in high school, so it really was a big change for me. I stood up one day and essentially was all of a sudden in pain, felt like something was wrong, and never really went back from there. When I first became disabled, I didn't know if I was going to need a mobility aid. I didn't really know what was going on at all. And so at the time I was like, I will just use a cane that we have around the house or crutches. And I was in high school at the time and had quite a few people make some comments which were really triggering to me and upset me at the time. I found that going from someone who had done basketball and things in the past to kind of having to walk around with kind of a limp and use an old wooden cane, it was very much feeling like not myself and very vulnerable to people making comments. And so I remember telling my mom about this, and I was like, I don't want any sort of like drugstore cane or one of these ones that like my grandma would use. And I wanted one that would match kind of my personality or even my outfits for. And I remember we looked up on like the London Drugs website or one of the pharmacy websites and tried to find a cane that was a colorful one, and that was difficult in itself. So it took a few years to transition from trying to focus everything on, it'll be better one day, to how can I manage with this the way I am right now, and how can I feel more comfortable in my own body given the situation I'm in. Having a mobility aid for me was kind of an outward signal of having a disability. So that was something that, took a long time to feel comfortable with. But also, if you don't have a diagnosis, it can be really difficult in the medical system, even trying to get things, and even like insurance for canes or other things. Like, they're not necessarily things you can get very easily without a diagnosis. So that it's feeling like, am I worthy of having a cane? Do I need one? I think it was back in 2020 that I discovered NeoWalk. With all the time in the pandemic where I was on my computer, and I started looking up bigger disability advocates in the social media space, and I found several advocates that were using NeoWalk walking sticks, and I had never seen anything cool like that before. And in my searches, I'd only really found like generic looking mobility aids that I didn't find suited me. They were doing like a giveaway, I think, at the time, and I entered the giveaway, but at the same time I was like, oh my gosh, like I need to figure out where these are from. In 2021 I got my first NeoWalk stick, which was super exciting. I was very happy when I got my first one, and I kind of have reached the point where now it's the ideal Christmas gift, graduation gift, things that my partner and my parents know that I would always be happy with. I first got the DNA, the do not ask, which I loved, but but my bachelor's degree is in biotechnology, specifically in genetics. And so having something that like looked like DNA, I thought was so cool, and I very often use it for conferences and things like that and get a lot of compliments. My Candy Crush is my newest one, and I absolutely love it. I'm not a pink lover, but I do wear a lot of neutrals, so it's really great. And oh my goodness, in the sun it looks so beautiful. I think for me, when I started using the NeoWalks, it was a huge change in the comfortability using a walking stick or a cane. I first felt very, uncomfortable and out of place using a cane, and just like it wasn't designed for me. There was nothing unique about it. You'd see people on the street that were using the exact same one. Or I'd go to my grandma's care home and you'd see people using the same canes as you, and I don't know, that got to me. And so using the NeoWalk sticks, I think, really gave me an opportunity to feel like something was unique to me and I had chosen it, and even the handle style and things like that. The fact that when you go to the website and you choose the size that fits you, for example, like, you give the height, the fact that that's like custom made for you compared to the other style canes where you have to just adjust it, and it's made for anyone from 4'8" to 5'11". That was really special to me to, measure and find out what exact size worked for me, and that was, custom made and sent over. I do find that, I now have a few NeoWalk canes, and that it's always part of my outfit now, and like what I feel comfortable wearing or what even the weather's like is kind of adjusting what I'd like to wear, and not feeling out of place at like formal events, for example. I talked to my mom, and my mom's like, oh my gosh, you already have a bunch of canes. And I'm like, okay, well, they suit different purposes. Number one, like I have a different non-NeoWalk folding cane that I use on days where I don't necessarily feel like I need the cane all day, but most of the times I use the NeoWalks, and whether I use a different handle and stuff, that's totally based on how I'm dealing with throughout the day. And like that with other mobility aids, but we don't think twice about people who have 30 pairs of shoes, for example, or different purses or glasses, jewelry. Like, it's all part of an outfit, and to be able to consider a mobility aid as just that was really impactful for me, rather than just being like, oh, this is a thing that I need to be using and it's just annoying, annoying essentially. Disability is seen as sometimes a bad word and something that needs to be covered up and is a bad thing, but in reality that many people are proud to be disabled, and while it might not be something that they've chosen, that they feel is a huge part of their identity that they don't want to hide from. I think that people treat me differently, whether I'm using a different style cane or a mobility aid, depending on what I'm using. When I first started using standard canes, I felt really out of place, and I think that showed to other people, and that I wasn't as confident and was kind of vulnerable to people making comments, versus now when I'm comfortable with my walking stick or rollator, for example, that I am so much more powerful in a way, and I feel like other people can see that. I think there's such a stigma when it comes to using mobility aids, especially when you may not have a diagnosis or feel like you're disabled enough to be using a mobility aid. It makes anything better for you if you can do more with a mobility aid and you are comfortable using one, then absolutely you should. And it does take a while to feel like that is the right thing for you, but trying is really an important step. And I definitely didn't love the fact that I used a mobility aid back when I wasn't using a NeoWalk, but now I feel like it allows me to do so much more than I was before. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't started originally with a mobility aid, to learn that the cane was helpful for me to do more distance or have more energy throughout the day. When I first started using a mobility aid, part of the reason why I felt I needed to use the mobility aid was because on public transit, I felt like I knew I needed a seat, but I didn't feel like I had a right to one without a mobility aid. And so when I would try and sit down, I would often have people make comments asking me to get up, for example. And even one time when I was using a mobility aid, I sat down, and as the bus was getting relatively full, a woman came on, and she was in her 40s maybe, and she kind of came to me and she's like, I need you to get up. And I had mobility, and I'm like, sorry, I can't stand on the bus. I'm really sorry. Maybe you can ask someone else. She's like, I'm older than you, so I deserve the seating. And I was like, this is the disabled seating on the bus. And she didn't have a mobility aid, but obviously that doesn't mean that she wasn't disabled. But she was using age purely as the determining factor on who deserved a seat on the bus. And she ended up throwing this huge fit, and the bus driver ended up having to get involved. But her stance was that I couldn't be as disabled or as needing as her, just purely based on age. And it really kind of proved to me that I felt like I needed my mobility aid, and even with the mobility aid, that was still a thought someone had. And I think it's pretty frequent of people feeling or being told that they're too young to be disabled or to be using a mobility aid. I've had people yell at me for stepping out of a car where my partner's driving and I have a handicap sign, and I'd get out, and some people are relatively nice and they're like, hey, just to let you know, you parked in a disabled spot. And I'm like, yes, I know. And I've even had someone accuse me of having just a cane in my car. It's like, or using like someone else's cane. Back when I was like using one of the ones that's generic and can fit kind of everyone. They're like, how do I know that's not your grandma's cane or your grandma's handicap sign? And I'm like, okay, well, number one, that's none of your business. And number two, like, please don't bother me. But yeah, there's definitely people that think that only old people or people in wheelchairs are ones that are disabled. And that unfortunately kind of adds to the stigma around mobility aids, and even our own internal feelings about whether we feel like we deserve to have mobility aids to support us. So it's harmful, and I don't think people recognize how difficult it can be to not have a diagnosis or to know whether you can call yourself disabled or not. And that's really just a question of yourself. And, you know, is that word going to be helpful for you? For me, it was a huge part of being okay with not having a diagnosis, was to feel comfortable calling myself disabled and fitting into that identity and that community, because otherwise I didn't feel like I had a community to fit in without a diagnosis. So one thing I really think is important for non-disabled people to know is that a lot of disabilities, including my own, are dynamic, and that just because you're using a walker or a wheelchair one day doesn't mean that you can't be using a cane the next. The days that people see me and I'm more energized and may not be using my cane a lot are generally days where I've slept 18 hours the day before. One thing I would say to my younger self is that it's okay to say no, and that some barriers are barriers that you can work past, and that they're more of a hurdle that you can prove people wrong and do more than what's expected of a disabled person. But sometimes the barriers can be too much of a barrier, and that's okay. The world a lot of infrastructure isn't made for disabled people, especially big institutions like universities and things like that. And it's okay to turn away and be like, this barrier is too much for me. That doesn't make you any less empowered or strong. It just means that that environment isn't set up to let you achieve or even succeed at all, and that's okay. That's not to do with you at all. And then the other thing I would say in terms of to myself, but also to other disabled people, is that you don't owe people an explanation for the mobility aid you're using, the fact that you're using a different mobility aid a different day, for having a handicap license, for having, for what your disability is in general. You're your own person. That's an invasion of someone's privacy, especially if you try and push that, and that you are allowed to say no, and that it's none of someone's business, and it's okay to be pushy if you need to, because that's not their right. It's your right to determine whether you want to share that. And just because you have a mobility aid or are visually disabled, that you don't owe someone an explanation of why you're disabled or using a mobility aid.